Having good manners is extremely important in most cultures. Politeness goes a long way in establishing and building relationships with others. In a similar way, formality and informality are important because you need to be able to adjust your speaking style depending on the situations you find yourself in. Think about it. Would you speak to your friends in the same way you speak to your grandmother? Would you speak to your boss in the same way you speak to your colleagues? Probably not. And while people of various cultures would agree that there are different degrees of formality to apply to each context, not all cultures have the same ways of showing politeness, manners, and formality. And of course, when you learn a language, you automatically have to learn the culture that comes with the language. This lesson is aimed at helping you gather some cultural knowledge as well as linguistic knowledge about English. My aim is to help you conduct yourself appropriately and confidently in all situations. To adjust your language to sound polite. You'll also learn how to identify impolite phrases and sentences. You will learn how to adapt your language to sound formal and informal. Plus, you will learn how to use typical telephone conventions. So, let's get into our first core topic for this lesson, politeness. Politeness is the avoidance of face-threatening acts. Do you know what face-threatening acts are? If we use politeness to avoid face-threatening acts, then surely they must be something negative or undesirable. Well, face-threatening acts are acts that threaten somebody's self-image. When I speak about acts, I'm speaking about what you are doing by saying something. Because, after all, everything you say has a purpose and does something in the world. We use politeness strategies to make face-threatening acts less uncomfortable. Some examples of face-threatening acts are insulting someone. Now, this is quite a clear face-threatening act. Insulting someone means telling someone something negative about them, like, you have a crooked nose. This directly threatens the hearer's self-image. In other words, it makes them look bad. Another example is asking someone to do something for you. In other words, requesting something from someone. You may be wondering how this threatens the hearer's self-image. Well, naturally, we all want to seem like kind, caring, and helpful people. So, when somebody asks us to do something for them, they put us in a position where we may need or want to say no. And saying no would make us look bad. So, requesting something from someone puts them in a very uncomfortable position. It imposes on their freedom, and it is thus a face-threatening act. Another example of a face-threatening act is asking someone out on a date. Similarly, we want everyone to think that we are kind and gentle, so if somebody were to ask you out on a date, it would put you in a difficult position because maybe you want to say no. Saying no would make you seem harsh and unkind. So, asking someone out on a date is a face-threatening act because it can make them appear negative in society. You may be quite surprised that some of those acts are face-threatening. It is very important to note that there are different face-threatening acts in each culture. In your culture, it may be very face-threatening to do one thing, but quite normal to do another. However, As you improve your English skills, you need to be aware of the widespread beliefs about politeness that are held within most English-speaking societies, so that you can use politeness strategies correctly and avoid uncomfortable situations. Consider this scenario as an example of how cultural differences can cause confusion and uncomfortable situations. Some of you may know already that in Chinese culture, some people use the phrase, "Have you eaten?" as a greeting. So instead of saying hello in Chinese language, you could say, "Have you eaten?" in some situations, depending on who you're speaking to. It's considered a completely normal greeting, and it doesn't literally mean that you want to know if the person has eaten. It simply means, "Hello, how are you?" It stems from the importance of food in Chinese culture. So, what if a Chinese person residing in an English-speaking society used "Have you eaten?" as a greeting? Some people might think that the person is being overly inquisitive. Some might even assume that the person wants to go have some lunch together. So, cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings. So it's important to be aware of the nuances of the culture to which you are trying to assimilate. Now, in English-speaking societies, there are some general politeness strategies that are, for the most part, applied across the board. Remember, there are still differences between different English-speaking cultures. After all, there are so many: British, American, Australian, Irish, Canadian, and many more. Now, before I tell you about some of the differences between American and British politeness, I would like to put out a disclaimer. The cultural differences that I'm about to mention are very general and broad. It's important to be aware that there are differences in politeness habits among different individuals, as well as between different regions. We can't assume that everyone in the entire country subscribes to the same politeness habits. It's a bit more complicated and nuanced than that. However, for the sake of time, I'm simply going to mention some brief generalizations about American and British politeness. In British culture, it's very common to say the word please a lot. This is done in an attempt to sound polite, though many argue that this has become so deeply part of British dialects that it's simply habitual. British people also prefer to be more indirect, so they would use more words to get a message across, and you would have to read between the lines a lot of the times because of how indirectly they tend to convey messages. Americans, on the other hand, tend to prefer directness. They would generally avoid using extra words or phrases. They would use far fewer words than British people to get the same message across. They prefer to communicate clearly and efficiently. Now, this is not because Americans are impolite. It's simply because their cultural norms are different to British cultural norms. An example of directness and indirectness between Americans and British people would be as follows. Upon telling a British person about a bizarre or crazy opinion or idea that you have, they would likely say something like, "That's a very interesting point of view," even though their real opinion is, "That is a bizarre idea." An American, on the other hand, would be more likely to voice their honest opinion. They would say something like, "That's crazy." Moving on back to face-threatening acts. acts, we will now discuss some politeness strategies that are used in general in most English-speaking societies. We will discuss some politeness strategies that you can use when you attend to someone else's needs. In other words, when you are being helpful to someone else. We will also discuss some politeness strategies you can use when you impose on someone else. In other words, when you request something from someone else. Firstly, let's talk about attending to someone else's needs. Although this is a kind thing to do, it is still a face-threatening act. Doing something for someone or giving something to someone creates social debt. It also means that the other person risks seeming ungrateful or entitled. If you plan to attend to someone else's needs, you can employ politeness strategies to make the situation a little less face-threatening and uncomfortable for the other person. Something you can do to help relieve the face-threatening nature of attending to someone else's needs is being assertive. Now, only use this strategy if you are confident that the person definitely wants or needs you to do something for them. Instead of asking someone if they would like you to do something for them, rather be assertive about it. For example, imagine your friend is terribly ill. You know that she needs someone to make her a cup of tea and look after her. Naturally, she wouldn't ask you to do anything for her because she doesn't want to impose. She doesn't want to seem bossy or entitled. Even if you offer, she is likely to say, "No, thank you." However, in this situation, you know that she needs the help and support because she is your friend and she is too ill to even get out of bed. So, you can be assertive by saying something like, "Let me make you a cup of tea," or "I'll get you a cup of tea." If your friend tries to persuade you not to do it, you can say, "Nonsense, it's not a big deal." Now, it may seem counterintuitive to use such assertive and almost coercive language as a politeness strategy, but remember that the point is to make the act as non-face threatening as possible, and being assertive helps to make it seem as if you are making your friend tea because you want to, not because they asked you to. You have already made up your mind. Thus, the assertiveness minimizes the face-threatening nature and keeps your friend's self-image intact. Another politeness strategy you can employ when attending to the needs of others is to include them in your action. In other words, make it sound like you are doing the action together. This decreases the social distance between you and makes it sound like a collaborative act, even though you are the one doing the person a favor. One way to do this is by using the pronouns we or us instead of I or me when stating your intention to attend to someone's needs. Let's use your sick friend as an example again. You could potentially say, "Let's get you a cup of tea," instead of saying, "Let me get you a cup of tea." Remember, let's is a contraction of let us. So, even though you are the person who will be making the tea, you can use the pronoun us to make it seem like a collaboration, thus minimizing the risk of your friend seeming bossy or entitled. Now let's talk about imposing on someone else. In other words, asking someone to do something for you or give something to you. As mentioned previously, this is a face-threatening act because if the other person refuses to do you the favor, they run the risk of seeming unkind. If you have to impose on someone else, you can use politeness strategies to make the situation less uncomfortable for the other person. The first strategy you can use is indirectness. This is when you avoid explicitly making the request. It gives the other person the opportunity to misunderstand instead of explicitly saying no. For example, if you want someone to close the window, you can say, "It's freezing in here." This gives them the opportunity to either catch the hint and close the window for you, or they can simply agree with you and say, "Yep, sure is cold," conveniently missing your hint. Your use of this strategy would mean that you are not imposing directly on the person. They still have the opportunity to opt out of your indirect request or hint. Another example is, if I want to ask someone on a date, I can ask them if they have plans on Saturday night, rather than asking them directly. That way, if they want to say no, they can simply say that they already have plans, thus avoiding them having to directly reject me. Another politeness strategy is simply acknowledging the imposition. In other words, making it clear that you are aware that you are imposing on the person. For example, "I'm terribly sorry, I hate to be a bother, but would you mind opening the window behind you?" This politeness strategy slightly minimizes the face-threatening act, but in many instances it would probably not be as effective as the indirectness strategy that you just learned about. Well, in fact, this strategy might be more effective in terms of getting the person to close the window for you, but it won't be as effective in terms of minimizing the face-threatening value of the act. The next politeness strategy you can use when imposing on others is the inclusion strategy. This is the same as the inclusion strategy for attending to somebody's needs. You can use this strategy when you would like someone to do something for you. It makes it sound like you are doing the action together. It decreases the social distance and makes it seem like a collaborative act. Again, you can make use of the pronouns we or us to employ this strategy. For example, if you would like someone to do the dishes, you can say, "Let's get on with these dishes," making it seem like more of a collaborative act. Of course, it's still not great to ask favors of people excessively, no matter how politely you do it. So try not to abuse these politeness strategies. Knowing these strategies doesn't mean that you can go around asking everyone for favors and requests. The strategies should only be employed within reason and only when necessary. Let's get on to our next core topic, formality. You've probably heard of the term formality before. Do you know what it is? Formality refers to the tone of speech or writing depending on the situation. For example, you'd use formal language in an office meeting, whereas you'd use informal language when socializing with friends. Let's look at some utterances. You will decide if they are formal or informal. Is this utterance formal or informal? I look forward to seeing you again next week. It's formal. You'd likely use this phrase in a business context. The next phrase is see ya. Formal or informal? It's informal. You'd likely say this to friends when saying goodbye. The phrase is a shortened version of I'll see you soon. It's most probably informal. You'd likely say this to a friend, and if you're in a shop, you would make sure that the store owner doesn't overhear you. How could you say this utterance more formally? You could say, I'm afraid my skin is a little sensitive to this dress material. To learn all about how to make your feelings known. You will learn about expressing your emotions in English. Plus, you will learn how to give or request advice, how to express and request obligation, and how to give and request permission. You will learn a whole lot of useful phrases and practical skills, so I look forward to seeing you at the next lesson. Our last core topic for this lesson is all about telephone manner. This lesson covers formal telephone conversations. You don't necessarily need to take these steps when you have informal phone calls with friends or family. So let's go over a very basic call structure. Phone calls with friends and family are usually not very structured. The purpose of such phone calls is usually just to catch up and chat informally. However, more formal phone calls, like business calls and appointment calls, tend to follow a basic structure. First, there's the greeting and introduction. Of course, since it's a phone call, it's necessary to greet each other, and if there's no caller ID, it's also necessary for the person who has made the call to introduce themselves. Then we get to the purpose of the call, which I call the problem and resolution. This is the part of the phone call where the person who has initiated the call outlines what they need help with or what they need clarification on. The person on the receiving end then attempts to answer the questions or resolve the issue. Multiple problems and resolutions might come up in this phase. So once all problems have been resolved, the speakers bid each other farewell, and that is the end of the conversation. Let's look at examples. The example we'll be looking at is a telephone conversation between a doctor's receptionist and a woman wanting to speak with the doctor. The greeting and introduction would look something like this. The receptionist would answer the phone and say, "Hello, Dr. James's office, Mishka speaking." And the person who has made the phone call would then say, "Hi Mishka, this is Kate." Now that the greeting and introduction phase is over, we have the problem and resolution phase. It starts with Mishka asking Kate, "Hi Kate, how can I help you?" And Kate will then clarify what she needs help with. She'd say, "I'd like to speak with Dr. James, please." Mishka would then attempt to attend to her problem. She'd say, "He's currently busy with a patient. Can I take a message?" And Kate would say, "Sure. Can you ask him to send my repeat prescription, please?" Mishka would then agree to resolve the problem and ask if there's any other problem that she would like her to resolve. Since there are no other problems, they can move on to the farewell stage. Usually in this stage, there are well wishes such as "Have a lovely day." You could also say "Keep well" or "Take care." Such a phone call usually ends with "Goodbye" or simply "Bye."